Namaste, welcome to season 2, episode
10.
of TT Talks. My name is Suhas,
My name is Kritika.
and today we have a special guest.
And my name is Parimal.
So, Dr. Parimal, do you want to give us a little bit of an introduction about yourself?
Yeah, I don't know where to start. My name is Parimal Patil. I currently teach at Harvard, where I am professor of Indian philosophy and also chair of the South Asian Studies Department. But I was born and raised in central Pennsylvania in a university town called State College. Both of my parents obviously were immigrants from India, and they came really early in the 50s.
Mm-hmm.
And so my brothers and sisters, I were all born and raised there and then went away for college.
Mm-hmm. And could you explain your academic process to reach your current position as a professor?
Sure, it was a difficult process. So I'm in my 50s, and when I was in high school and thinking about going off to university and what to study, it was not really an option for good Indian boys to go off to Ivy League schools with an interest in the humanities.
Mm-hmm.
That was just not a good option. And I think for all the obvious reasons, it didn't seem like it was a good career move. There were questions about whether it was of value or not. And so I started off college doing a degree in biophysics with an interest in perhaps going on to medical school, which was considered a sensible option in those days. And I always had an interest in the humanities, but didn't know that because in the high school I went to, I just basically did a lot of math and science and took all the English and history courses because you had to take them. So I went to college at the University of Pennsylvania at Penn, and I went primarily there because I wanted to do some combination of science and engineering and maybe some finance or something like that, sensible things.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to always take distribution requirements of some kind, right, everywhere. And so I ended up walking into this class on Plato, taught by a very well-known professor of classical philosophy named Charles Kahn. And I kind of smugly sat in the back of the class and listened to this lecture. And this is going to sound kind of hokey, but it's true. I had tears in my eyes midway through this lecture. I just could not believe it. I could not believe that somebody else, that means Plato, who I'd never heard of before, that Plato had thought about all the same things I'd been worried about most of my life and never really had anyone to talk to about it. And I was shocked that someone could spend their life studying philosophy, studying questions about what there is and what there is like and what's knowledge and why anyone should care about this. Mm-hmm. And so immediately on my way back to my dorm room, I also decided I'd do another major in philosophy and picked up philosophy. So I ended up doing a degree in philosophy, a degree in biochemistry. Mm-hmm. And I really wanted to study philosophy further. And this was all Western philosophy at the time. There was no option of doing anything with classical India or Indian philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to study philosophy, but choosing to be a philosopher is not a good career move. You're basically going to be laughed at by most people. You're not sure if it's worth doing, and you figure you're not going to be making a lot of money. So it didn't seem like a great place to start. So when I first came to Harvard, I decided I was going to do medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And it took about a year or so to realize that I really didn't want to do that. And I really probably wasn't suited for that as well as other things. And I didn't know really what to say to my family about the decision to do something else. And finally, it took me a year. And in that year, I was working at what's called the behavioral medicine unit now, but it used to be at the Deaconess Hospital. And I was studying the physiology of meditation. That was my sort of interest, a way of trying to combine my interest in philosophy of mind and science. And I finally figured out that I needed to tell my parents that as immigrants, they'd worked too hard for any of their children to do their second choice. And that my first choice was to do philosophy. And so I actually started doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was doing contemporary Anglo-American philosophy, analytic philosophy. And while I was doing that, sort of a long-winded answer to your question, but while I was doing that, a family friend came from India to visit and said, Parimal, look, you're doing philosophy. Ever thought about doing philosophy from classical India, Indian philosophy? And I said, look, I'm not interested in the Gita and in the Upanishads and in that kind of stuff. I'm interested in, technical philosophy about metaphysics and epistemology and philosophy of language. And he said, well, look, there's all that in classical India too. And I said, really? I had no idea. I'd spent my life at these snobby schools. I'd been to India probably a dozen times by then for 4 months at a time. Fairly culturally open and educated family, but never heard about this stuff. And so we went on a walk, and he explained in some detail some parts of Sanskrit philosophy of language and parts of Sanskrit metaphysics. And I was like, this is great. All right, this is exactly what I'm interested in. I'd always had an interest in India, but never knew how to really pursue it. And so I said, what do you do next? And he said, well, why don't you take a Sanskrit class and see how it goes? So I stumbled into first year Sanskrit, and that just kind of blew my mind, because it was very clear very quickly that there was this incredibly long-standing, rich, sophisticated intellectual tradition in pre-modern India that basically everyone paid lip service to, but nobody knew anything about. And so I realized that, and then I ended up getting a grant that summer to go to India, and I started studying in the traditional way in Sanskrit medium with these traditionally trained teachers. And it was sort of midway through that summer that I realized I wanted to focus on Indian philosophy. And so then I came back and I mentioned this to my advisor, who was a man named Hilary Putnam. And I realized very quickly that you couldn't do that, that wasn't even an option. That while he was supportive and faculty were supportive of me as a person, they weren't really supportive of the project, because they had as much knowledge of Indian philosophy as I did, which was basically nothing. And so I realized there was going to be a problem. So I kept studying Sanskrit and studying philosophy. And midway through my PhD work, I realized that I needed to leave Harvard if I wanted to do the Indian stuff seriously. And I ended up going to the University of Chicago and did a PhD in what we call then philosophy of religion, which is really just Sanskrit philosophy. And then as soon as I finished, I came back to Harvard to teach. So one of the greatest things about coming back to a place where you're a student is to be able to teach the classes you wish you could have taken but didn't exist. And so in a way, that's what I've seen my opportunity and mission at Harvard as being, is to try to design and teach the kind of courses I wish had existed when I was a student. And I'm still stumbling my way on that mission.
Wow.
Long-winded answer to a good question. Sorry.
No, you're good.
That's really incredible.
That is, truly. And what sparked your interest towards teaching from just learning about philosophy?
So usually anyone who does something that isn't a good career move, somebody who wants to be a musician or an artist or a professional athlete or be a professor in the humanities, it's about the same, right? It's just not a good career move, particularly because you could do other things. You're obsessed with it. You're obsessed with certain kinds of questions, and you're obsessed with a certain way of pursuing them. So for me, the only way to keep pursuing them in a serious way was to be a professor in a university. So the interest there's no other way to do it. You can't do it as a hobby at a certain level, beyond a certain level. You just can't. So the idea was, if I'm really serious about trying to study this stuff and trying to sort of, the way I call it, infect our curriculum with South Asian content in a serious way, I need to try to do it full time. And the only way that I knew to do that was to do it as a professor in a university. And I knew that teaching was a way of sharing, right? And so I knew that if I could be an effective teacher, then even if the research work I did was not read by many people, the kind of work that I studied could have an impact. So for me, teaching was about impact and about reaching people in a way that when you do research in a very specialized area, you're writing for very few people, but teaching is something that's going to be broader. And so that's how sort of the teaching and research came together in a way that made this kind of a career a reasonable way to think about sort of putting everything together.
That's really interesting. So how many languages can you speak?
So you might find this hard to believe, but I'm not really very good at languages. in the
Uh-huh.
sense that I have friends who language learning comes so easily.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Same.
For me, it just, everything has been hard. But now I can make my way through, at least half a dozen, maybe a few more different languages.
Oh, wow.
Mhm. That's really cool.
Mostly reading, and then some I speak better than others, some I write better than others, but mostly reading. Most of my work, though, focuses on classical Sanskrit material.
Mhm.
Okay.
And I think a lot of Indian languages are derived from Sanskrit, so there's a lot of similarities between them.
It's interesting. You know how words like similarity works, right? It all depends on context, in the sense that we're all similar in some ways and different than others. And so if we think about functional similarity, knowing a modern South Asian language doesn't help you very much with reading classical Sanskrit, and reading classical Sanskrit doesn't help you very much with reading a modern South Asian language. What you do get is you get certain lexical similarity, vocabulary, and you get, in some cases, certain kinds of syntax and grammatical similarity. But
Mhm.
you're right, there's a lot of areas of similarity, particularly at the level of words, at the level of ideas, and sometimes, depending on the language, the level of grammar.
Mm-hmm.
And just think, derived is a funny word too, right? Because some people use that in different ways, right? Some people want to say, oh, because something came from something, the
Mhm.
source is the most important, and everything else is a kind of corruption, right?
Mhm.
We don't want that. It privileges the origin. And that would be like us privileging, Neanderthals or something. It doesn't make sense. So all the things that we think about rightly about Sanskrit, and it's being old, and it's being an origin, and things coming from it, we have to be really careful, because that can be easily misused, right? And as we see happening nowadays, that kind of thing, an honest, genuine interest in say Sanskrit and how it relates to what we do today, can get easily twisted. So we want to be extra careful in how we think about old and classical and origins, and what we think that says about us today, and things like that.
And yeah, so I heard about your work, The Buddhist Philosophy of Language in India, co-authored by Dr. Lawrence McCrea. Do you think you could explain a little bit of where your interest in Buddhism sparked from?
Yeah, this is also a kind of, it's a story like how I came to this in the first place.
Okay.
So Sanskrit philosophy basically was done by people we today would call Buddhists, people we today would call Jain, and people who we today call Hindu.
Mhm.
It's really all part of one intellectual culture and one intellectual climate, though people's views and religious identities were very, very different. So choosing to do philosophy in Sanskrit doesn't tell you much about anyone's identity. It's just the language in which academic work was done, in the same way that academic work was done in Latin in Europe, though even more broadly. So when you study Sanskrit philosophy, my commitment was to study I didn't really know what I wanted to study initially. And after learning a little bit more Sanskrit and studying in India, I decided I wanted to study a particular text tradition called Nyaya, which is the tradition of epistemology. It's a non-Buddhist tradition of epistemology. And the figure I wanted to study was a person named Udayana, who lived at this very critical moment, sort of during the final phase of Buddhist philosophy in India.
Mhm.
And so I thought, okay, great, I've got this topic, it's really cool. Udayana seems like he's really smart. And I started reading the first page of Udayana's book, and I had no idea what he was talking about. None, zero, nothing.
Uh-huh.
And I suffered for a couple months, and I realized that one reason I didn't know what he was talking about is I didn't know what the Buddhist opponents he was really engaging with was talking about, what they were talking about, because the work of these Buddhist philosophers had not really been studied or translated. And it also happened that at that time, there was a very well-known professor of Buddhist philosophy at Harvard, so he could help me. And so I started reading the Buddhist opponents of Udayana in the hope of eventually understanding Udayana. And it took me, so that's what the first few books I wrote were about. They're about these Buddhist philosophers, the Buddhist philosophy of language in India. is a book by one of the Buddhist philosophers, actually the Buddhist philosopher who Dhyana really targets in his work. And so in a way, that the first 15 years I've been doing research in this area has been on looking at the opponents. And the next 10 or 15 years will be on continuing that, but really focusing on the Nyaya critic, on the people I wanted to write my dissertation on originally. So the field is such, it's hard to explain, but even though there's so much Sanskrit philosophy, there's very little written about it. And there's very little that's accessible to people who aren't kind of professional nerds about all this stuff. So it's slow going, you know what I mean? It's slow going. But now I'm ready to write about Udayana, and I understand him a little bit better. And so that's kind of where I am with that. So that's how I decided to write on that, was I needed it intellectually for what I thought I was primarily interested in. They were good teachers. And the thing with Sanskrit philosophy is if you understand anything well, it's going to help you understand everything well. So might as well start there.
Okay.
So in general, like, who do you find takes your classes the most? Like students interested in majoring in philosophy, or like, do some people just take it like to see if they're interested, or?
Yeah, so there's different kinds of classes. I teach some classes that are just sort of general education kinds of classes, which have no prerequisites and aren't really disciplinary in a sense. So they're not really philosophy classes. Remember, I told you that one of the reasons I was excited about being a professor was to kind of infect our curriculum with South Asian content. The idea is that you can be interested in Shakespeare without having any interest in England. So why can't you be interested in South Asian content without having any interest in South Asia? Maybe you're interested in poetry or literature, or maybe you're interested in ideas. You don't have to imprison South Asian ideas in their place, because the people who wrote of this stuff, they didn't write just for people from their time and place, right? So there are these general kinds of classes that are meant for everyone who have no background. And people take those for a number of reasons. Obviously, if they fulfill requirements, some people just take them because it fulfills a requirement. Other people take it because they have an interest in South Asia or in India, or in Indian culture or literature or philosophy, and want to take a class to get exposed to it. And so that group is quite diverse. Other classes I teach for undergraduates are in the philosophy department, and they're on Indian philosophy specifically, either Buddhist philosophy or non-Buddhist Sanskrit philosophy. And those are taken usually by people who are either philosophy majors or have taken other philosophy classes, and occasionally by people just who have a background, who have an interest in pre-modern India. One of the challenges for South Asian Americans is that in general, and I'll use we here, in general, we don't know anything about pre-modern India or pre-modern South Asia, but we think we do. And what we think we do is usually not consistent with what was actually the case. And so what's interesting is that students of South Asian origin who come take the classes really struggle sometimes, because they're reading things and hearing things that really goes against their sort of educated common sense about what pre-modern India was like, or about pre-modern Indian religions were like, or what Indian philosophy is about. And so that's been really interesting to see. It's been, instead of it being, it's often viewed negatively. It feels uncomfortable to hear about things that are familiar to you in ways that just don't seem to ring true to you. And so that's been interesting to try to think about what to do about that. Because the classes are challenging in the sense that they're challenging, not because they're hard, they're challenging. They're challenging because the material is difficult. It's not what you expect. It's not easy, but it also challenges, for South Asian Americans and Indian Americans, it challenges what you think you already know, and what you think your cultural context is. That's why it's worth teaching and worth studying, but it's also why it's hard to teach and hard to study.
And then within your curriculum, are there any specific texts that you use, like the Mahabharata or other like texts?
So yeah, the idea is to do two things. It's to teach things that people have heard about and help them to see them in new, more accurate, and therefore more helpful ways. And the second is to expose them to things they should know about, but don't. So in the general education classes, there's a range of courses. The Mahabharata and Ramayana are included. There's poetry and literary, sort of poetry and prose. There's also, in other courses, there are these so-called, well, let me put it this way. There's really, I try to cover the gamut. That means a representative of every genre and all the theoretical work on that genre. So in one class, you might focus on, there's a course called Love in a Dead Language, which is on classical Sanskrit literature and literary theory. There's another course called The Good Life in Classical India, which is about the Purusharthas, or the goals of human beings. And in that class, you read sort of technical books in each of the goals, sort of dharma, artha, kama, and moksha, so to speak. And then you also read literary works that engage with those goals and undermine them in some interesting ways, make it more complex. And the idea of the class is to try to use classical Indian material to create a kind of good life compass. So the range is quite broad. And then in the philosophy classes, we're reading texts and authors that almost no one has ever heard of, but who are incredible. It would be like, imagine, never having heard of Plato or Aristotle or Kant or something like that. I mean, these figures are as important, if not more important, to the history of India than Plato, Aristotle, and Kant are to the history of intellectual life in Europe. Yet almost no one in India, let alone outside, has heard of any of these figures, whether Buddhist or otherwise. And there's almost no one who reads them anymore. So that's one reason to start teaching this stuff. And
I feel like this is one of the most applicable to world courses in like, if we're talking about education wise, because like philosophy is like a very, it's a type of thinking that you use almost every day, and like I feel like it's very applicable to real world knowledge, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it can be. People often say to you, well, people like to say, well, philosophy is just BS after all, isn't it? And my answer is to say, you're exactly right. It is, because it's the fertilizer that helps everything you care about to grow. And one reason for that is that studying philosophy forces you to not only read and write carefully, but it forces you to really pay attention to arguments. What is an argument? What is a good argument? When is it that the best argument you can make isn't worth making, right? What are you allowed to conclude or infer on the basis of the arguments you're making? So I think in that way, it can be really foundational if you like that way of thinking and enjoy being questioned and interrogated about the words you use and what they mean and what you try to say with it. So I think that's right. The one question we should always ask is, look, you can do all that with Western philosophy. Why bother teaching Indian philosophy? As you've said, it's harder. There's not as good translations. There's not as good material. So why bother working with Sanskrit philosophy? Why bother teaching these general education courses with Indian content instead, if you could do the same thing with non-Indian content? And many people have different answers, and you guys might have your own ideas on why that is. And here's how I think about it. I think that first, and this isn't my primary motivation, but it's just the one I'll say first, that there's a kind of social and political imperative that if we're going to have universities that meant to preserve and teach the important works in history, that we not just include the important works from Europe. That just seems like a moral and political imperative. So even if it is exactly the same, that's okay. It's an imperative that we do it for representation. That's the first thing. The second thing is, we're lucky it's not the same. There are differences. And it turns out, surprise, surprise, that the smartest people in the history of our world and the greatest artists in the history of our world didn't just produce work in Latin and Greek and French and German. And some of them produced work in classical Sanskrit or Arabic or Chinese. And that work is distinctive. It's actually distinct. It's not the same. It's different. And so what that means is that we really do have something that we can learn from them. And learning from other people, as you know, is not easy. It takes really hard work to truly learn from someone else. And that's one of the challenges and joys of working with this material. because there are things that are distinctive. We tend to focus on what's similar, and I think that's a mistake. I think we need to focus on what's distinct.
Yeah. So as a professor at Harvard, have you noticed any problems in the student body relating to South Asian representation or in like Cambridge in general?
What do you mean by South Asian representation exactly?
In the academic sense, there's classes related to South Indian studies.
Right.
But like if we're talking about like cultural events on campus or like other festivals and stuff, are they well represented on campus?
Yeah, so it's really interesting, and this is true, I think, of many of the Ivy League schools, and less true of larger state institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And this is just my view, and others who are listening may have very different views and experiences, but there isn't really a lot of connecting of what happens outside the class extracurricularly and what happens curricularly.
Mm-hmm.
So the South Asian student, the student organizations that are for students of South Asian origin or that are primarily deal with South Asian content, those events are well attended, students participate, it's an important part of social life and cultural identity. They get something meaningful from it that they wouldn't give up. There's no question. And that's a really good thing, right? No, that's a really good thing.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting is that South Asian students at Harvard in particular don't relate to the classes on South Asia in the same way.
Okay.
So you don't have a disproportionate number of South Asian students of South Asian origin in your classes.
Okay.
In the language classes, you do. But in the so-called non-language classes, you don't. And that is surprising. And it may have to do with the kinds of majors here at Harvard, we call them concentrations, people do, but I think that's not it. I think it has to do with the fact that the classes are difficult. They're not simply easy grades. You also discover very quickly that the background you think you have doesn't really help you in many of them. And so I think that it becomes maybe a bit challenging in too many ways.
Okay.
And so people you don't have a disproportionate representation, which you might expect, right? You might expect there to be a disproportionate number of South Asian students in South Asian studies classes. You generally don't have that. And you certainly don't have that in my classes. Though in some of my colleagues' classes, you do.
Okay.
Does that help, Suhas, with the question of representation?
Yeah. I wanted to ask that question because all of us were going to a state school, and we actually don't have a lot of South Indian curriculum at our schools. So it's mainly just like the student body events, like Diwali or like that. So we were just curious of like if there was a difference in having a curriculum, whether that would affect people maybe being more intertwined and knowledgeable about South Indian culture.
Yeah, it's really interesting that I think the answer is no. And that's true at Harvard. It may not be true other places. And it's worth saying that US universities for all practical purposes, there's almost no South Asian content at US universities. It's the odd university that has a South Asian Studies department, which isn't necessary for having good South Asian content, by the way. You don't have to have a South Asian Studies department. And in fact, the best thing for South Asian Studies may be not to have South Asian Studies departments, but to have people who study South Asia or India in a variety of departments. You just don't have enough people teaching enough courses for it to be really visible on most campuses. So the experience that you're having where you don't have, remember the experiences I had when I came to Harvard, there were no courses that I wanted to take, right? At Penn, we had a very good South Asian Studies department. There were some courses I wanted to take, but still not a large number. And so the kinds of courses I want to take now exist at Harvard because I teach them. But I can't say that Harvard has not paid appropriate attention to South Asia and is not focused on it historically in the way it should. And I don't know if you know why this is the case, but this is pretty crude, but After World War II, the universities were kind of divided up.
Okay.
And there were going to be some universities where South Asia was focused, some universities where East Asia was focused on, some universities where Southeast Asia was going to be the focus.
Okay.
And so at Harvard and at Princeton, for example, they were East Asia centers.
Mm-hmm.
Madison, Penn, Chicago were South Asia centers. Cornell was a Southeast Asia center. So what that meant is there were certain universities where there were extra resources provided for the study of very specific regions.
Uh-huh.
And then as that, it's called the area studies model, sort of post-Cold War area studies model began to time out, that universities that were primarily East Asia, like Harvard and Princeton, recognize that no, it's appropriate to have a presence in South Asian studies as well. But you're already now 50 years later.
Yeah.
So 50 years of funding behind, 50 years of training behind, 50 years of people behind. And so it gets very difficult institutionally, especially in the new economic environments, to expand and grow in the right ways.
Mm-hmm.
But traditional South Asia centers like Chicago are still doing well. Berkeley was a South and Southeast Asia center. And other South Asia centers that were traditionally strong are not as strong as they used to be for a variety of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one reason why we in the US don't see a lot of South Asian studies courses on campus for a number of reasons. South Asia was just not that important.
Mm-hmm.
Very frankly, it was not that important. Remember, economically, Japan was always important first, and then China became important, and South Asia became important. This is sort of crude, but once India and Pakistan got the bomb, it became important, right? Culturally, demographics are making a difference. So I would say that what's changing now in the US is that the demographics on campus are very different, right? You look around, you see South Asian Americans, you see professors of South Asian origin, regardless of what they teach. So there's now some audible, visible presence on campus that in a way really does help expose inadequacies and also creates a kind of demand. Where it gets difficult is that students talk about wanting to have courses in South Asian studies in certain areas, but then they don't take them. And so that gets interesting too.
Yeah.
And you guys know better why that might be the case.
I mean, I think it's because we're more focused on taking courses that impact our major more rather than trying to explore. I don't know. What do you think, Suhas?
I think that's definitely a factor. I feel like people pay more attention towards the STEM courses rather than the humanity courses.
And look, I get it, because that was the same as I told you from my story. That's exactly where I started. And the question is, why? I mean, we must at some level think that the humanities courses aren't that important, either because they're not going to help us. And what does help us mean? Does help us seems to mean help us get a job, or help us in our career, or help us with our street cred on the street when we talk about what we're taking. There's a sense in which it doesn't help us. And that's because I think we have a pretty impoverished view of what we need and what we think helps. And that's a big, big problem.
True.
So how do you then explain to someone why it might help? There it gets interesting. So this is my story. I don't know what you guys think. So this is meant for South Asian Americans specifically. Right? So when you face a problem, what do you do? Actually, what do you do? Who do you talk to? What do you do?
Well, I think I would talk to my dad first, probably, and then probably a friend.
Talk to your dad, you talk to a friend. I take it you go back over in your own mind what had happened.
Yeah.
Many times.
Yeah, and if it's a relationship problem, you probably think about what you're like in relationships, your history. Maybe you talk to past partners, maybe you talk to people. You'd have all this access to your past, not just from your perspective, but from the perspective of other people as well. And somehow those would be the resources you might rely on to help you navigate a tough time, right? That's as an individual. Culturally, what do you do if there are cultural problems? You need, my thought is you want to have access to cultural memories.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, studying pre-modern South Asia, pre-modern India, is a way of having access to cultural memories that we really no longer have access to. So this way of putting it is just one way of explaining why it might be useful for people who want to claim a certain kind of cultural identity and for whom having that identity is important to actually educate themselves about their memories. You never know when those memories are going to come in handy, but they are going to come in handy at some point, and you can be sure. Because right now, the picture we have, we means in general, of South Asia, and the access we have to South Asian cultural resources is pretty bad. I think there's very, very few of us who are South Asian Americans who have enough access to South Asian cultural resources that we think we can rely on them to actually help us in our life, instead of being more annoying value statements, right, that we don't actually believe. Does that make sense? I mean, what do we have access to? Not much.
Yeah.
Slogans. We don't even have common reference point to really stories or literature or ideas or alternative ways of living or seeing the world or understanding how some of the things that we get from our family histories either ring true or have resources in the past or are breaks from the past. And so we don't really have a cultural, I feel like we don't have access to our cultural resources. By the way, I don't feel that's true just of South Asian Americans. I feel that's true of even my relatives and friends who are in India or Pakistan or wherever it's themselves. So one thing I think we get by challenging ourselves, it's by forcing us to get access to cultural memory.
I think that's a really fascinating way of thinking about it, actually.
Yeah. And like, as you said, like cultural memory, like I think it would also help in like just seeing a different way on like how to go at problems and like relate back to like history.
Yeah, and it's more, I've used the phrase cultural memory, but it's also cultural resources. Like, we use our friends not only because they actually remember, but because they may know something about us, and when we tell them something, we're able to bounce it off of them in a way they help us to see things we don't want to see in ourselves, or understand things that we don't want to see in ourselves. And so I actually think there's a cultural counterpart to this individual business, and that cultural counterpart are these cultural resources. Actually, that's for those who want to claim them as their own. For others who don't want to claim them as their own, it goes back to the earlier point about, look, some of the most interesting stuff wasn't done by people who are from where you are or from identities you want to claim, and you can learn from others too. So that's kind of part of it too. But I don't know, what do you guys think? Why do you think someone, for example, you said there weren't that many South Asian Studies courses on your campus. If there were, would you take them? And if so, why would you take them? Let me put it this way. Why would you waste a class taking something on South Asia? Especially if it were hard and you might not get an A.
Well, if we were supposed
to ask.
I mean, if we were to suppose that we had like a South Indian like curriculum at our school, I would probably take it because I don't know, I have experience with like the entertainment side of South India, but I also want like the academic side, Like I want to balance it out on both ends. In fact, I was actually like, because my school doesn't have a South Indian department, I was actually planning on taking classes at a different university, Emory University, for South Indian courses. Like, in fact, our organization was invited to one of their lectures a couple months ago, and I think that's what really interested me in taking actual academic classes. So, I mean, I feel like there should be a way to always get access to South Indian academic resources, but it just should be an easier way.
Yeah, look, Emory's a great example, especially for all of you, because it's one of the few places in the country where they have someone who works in Telugu, right? And also Harshita, right? And also people who work in other areas of South Asia, right? Who do a little bit of history, who do religion. So you have a core group of people there that does it. And even at Emory, for example, the numbers of students who are taking the classes is not huge, right?
Mhm.
But they have the resources. And I agree. I think it would be ideal if people had access to our classes. So for example, one thing that was interesting about Zoom is that when we were all on Zoom, even though the university doesn't like it, we were able to let people from other universities Zoom into our classes.
Oh, okay.
And in part, they don't have those classes, so why couldn't they Zoom into them, right? Another thing that I have been doing is I've recognized this and have desperately wanted to try to do something about it personally, and I've been struggling to figure out how. And someone finally said to me, Parimal, why don't you try teaching some of these courses in the extension school, which is in the evening? Because the evening courses are places where people who are not from Harvard can take classes. And I thought, oh, I really don't need to do that. It's just extra work. But I actually did. And to tell you the truth, it's been a really good experience because you have people in this class, in these classes, who would never have access to this before. And who therefore can do it. The ultimate goal, of course, is to learn how to do it well and produce the materials online so that one can then just record it and give it all away for free. So the goal really should be, and I don't know, universities don't like this, but the goal should be to have these courses, make them available with all the handouts and all the lectures online so people at other universities and people in India, if they want, can come and take these classes and get exposed at least to how things are done here. And it's not because the way things are done here or the way I do it is better than others. It's just that there's so few opportunities that it's worth doing. Because YouTube, as rich and sophisticated as it is, doesn't have this kind of stuff on it yet.
True.
And I feel like there's like a blurred line between having free resources, but also an institution, because like some institutions, they don't want to do that because then students wouldn't want to apply in the first place.
Exactly. I mean, I personally feel that, we don't have to worry about that at Harvard. So if I can give away stuff, fine, But that's the idea. So I really feel that one way, it's kind of like interlibrary loan, we've actually come to a time where it's pretty clear all the universities aren't going to do what they're supposed to do. They're not going to be able to hire enough people to do everything. Just like no libraries anymore are buying everything. So there has to be, given that reality, there has to be some kind of partnership or some way of doing interlibrary loan, so to speak. One way are these extension school classes, which are cheap, basically. And the other is to find ways to allow students from other places to come to your classes, or at least have the content of that class available in some other format. So it's not easy because of intellectual property rights and, of course, branding and, of course, business model. So I get it. We all get it. But I don't really see a big rush to universities to hiring people to teach pre-modern Indian literature. So that brings up something else. What are we going to do? What can be done about this? It seems to me pretty clear, and it seems to be pretty clear that universities are not going to do this on their own. University development offices are not running around trying to find people to fund the study of classical Indian culture or modern Indian culture, anything like that. And when they approach people of South Asian origin, the people they approach aren't even really given an opportunity to fund these areas because their resources are being put toward things that they might do themselves. So they might be doing STEM things or computer things or medical things or maybe even religion in some cases, but not toward these kind of more basic, I call it basic humanities work. And my view is that, and this is controversial too, my view is that as a community, we, again, South Asian Americans, or however you want to use that label, we as a community have enough temples and have enough community centers. We need to invest long-term in transforming sort of university education, because transforming university education is permanent. You have a charity university, it's there for life. You have 3, it's there for life. And so I hope that over the next, generation, the community decides to invest in universities, because I don't know any other place where we have a good chance of creating opportunities that people like you or that my kids, for example, can take if they want. And not just our kids, but I mean, I think it's for everybody, as I said, but I just don't know any other way to do it. I don't see what the kinds of instruction that's going on in temples and community centers is all fine, but I don't find that it's no substitute. It only complements what's done in the university. It's no substitute for it. So that's kind of just university life.
Yeah, and I think one of like the biggest impacts that this could have is like kind of keeping like I don't want to say tradition, but like what's the word? The philosophy, I guess, alive and like kind of spreading it on in the generations too.
I mean, no, we have to ask. I mean, you're right. We don't have a good mechanism for learning or teaching about India. We just don't, especially Indian cultural resources or humanities resources. We just don't have good ways of doing it, in part because a lot of things aren't translated, and even if they are well translated, you won't make any sense of them. For example, no matter how well you speak English, or let me give you an example. No matter how well you know the numbers, that doesn't mean you can read any math book. Why? You know the numbers. Well, it's because knowing the numbers isn't sufficient. It's just a start. So even, for example, classical Indian literature that's well translated, you can't just pick it up and read it as if it were a newspaper or as if it were a book in English. Why? Because it's distinctive. And what happens is people then either try to hammer away all the distinctions, so it sounds just like reading a newspaper, in which case you miss what's interesting about it, or you don't understand and you pretend you do, and then you don't get it either. So in a way, we don't have good translations, but worse, we don't have the kinds of instructions on how you're supposed to read that material. And that's just for literary work and poetry. When you start getting to more technical things, it's even more difficult. So that's kind of that's one of the problems. So I think that's why I think that universities might be the right place to do this. And I really don't see an alternative. I don't see the Bal Bharati kind of model as an alternative to that. Because again, it's very hard to do this well as a hobby. At least for me. I mean, I'm slower than most, so at least for me it's hard. Maybe for others it isn't, but for me, it's hard.
And a lot of our viewers are going to college this fall and would like to stay connected with their culture. What steps do you think they should take if they want to find a sense of community at big universities?
So I think there's the two things, community and culture, are related, but they're not the same. So obviously, to create a sense of community, we all wear many hats, right? I'm a man, I'm over 50, I'm of South Asian origin, I was born in Pennsylvania, I study philosophy, I like to go fishing. I mean, all these different hats. So each of these hats has a community associated with it, right? So I take it when you talk about community now, you're talking about community having to do with being Indian or being South Asian or something like that, right? So one way to create that community is, as you said, almost every university I can think of has some South Asian students organization, probably more than one. And so that's a place to start. It may not be your community, but it may be a place to start collecting the community that you want to organize around the South Asian hat you wear. Cultural also means two different things in our sense. We have this sense of cultural as we currently understand it, which might mean, Diwali or some kind of dance festival or Bollywood night or just eating good food. And that's one way. And these organizations are ideal ways of doing that. But there's another way of culture, which is sort of what we've been talking about, which is more getting underneath the hood, trying to challenge oneself, trying to really discover. And that's harder. That requires trying to find classes where you can read this stuff and actually taking it seriously. It means really reading the stuff, not because the class has assigned it, but because you really want to try to get to the bottom of it. You want to really try to understand it. and really take that seriously. So I would say those are the two ways to do it going forward. And I would say for those who are starting college, or even those who are in college, if you think this might be important to you, either the community part or the culture part and the academic culture part, it's not going to be easy.
Mm-hmm.
Learning is hard. New insights don't come cheap, and you can't predict when you're going to get them.
Mm-hmm.
But if you think it's worth doing, put your shoulder to it and see what you get.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have to do it quietly, carefully, and deliberately, or you probably won't get anything out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the real problem is that people have a hard time of deciding when to take the leap. So like moving from a safe career to like a career like philosophy, I feel like people aren't able to identify maybe when it's the right time to do that.
Yeah, and look, I think that's a good thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? You don't want to jump into uncertainty,
Mm-hmm.
and especially you don't want to embark on something if you just aren't going to make it.
Yeah.
It's like someone who says, I want to be a professional basketball player. That's great, but if you're not an awesome basketball player, you shouldn't even think about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the thing to remember is that it's really not about a career per se. You could study
Mm-hmm.
philosophy and study this stuff, not because you want to do it the rest of your life, but because it's just an important part of your education. We need to remember that education is not just about getting a job. It's about preparing us for the rest of our life.
Mm-hmm.
And that second part is much harder than the first part. And to pursue an education for the rest of your life, you need to take things that really interest you or that you think might interest you. And you need to invest the time and energy into doing that. And is it going to take away from the other things? Yes. That's why it's important, because it gives you something.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't give it to you for free. So I would say have the courage to make sure you always follow your interests with at least one course, if not 2 or 3 courses a semester. Always. And I know all of you and your listeners don't just have one set of interests.
Yeah.
True.
I think that basically sums it up, I think.
I know it's easier said than done. So.
All right. Yeah. Thank you so much for your talk today.
Sure. My pleasure.
Sure.
I talked too much and didn't listen enough.
Oh no, that was really great information. I feel like we don't get a perspective on the non STEM approaches to education that much. So this was really insightful.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of the guests on our talks are their work community, and your work is in the classroom. And I think that's a really unique approach to preserving our philosophy and culture.
Yeah, it's a very different way of understanding what that is.
Mm-hmm.
What it means to sort of preserve. And I'm actually less interested in preserving and more interested in teaching people how to use it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think culture is supposed to be used. So I actually don't have a problem with cultural appropriation. I have a problem with cultural misappropriation. And so I want people to use South Asian culture. I don't care who you are. I want you to learn it. And I don't want you to insult it or be rude or anything, but I want you to use it. And so I think teaching and making it accessible is a way of giving people that opportunity.
Yep. That's it. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.